Hello everyone and welcome back to this next part. We are now going to take what we did in the last video for menu navigation, and we're going to see if we can bring in the inventory module for Game Creator 2 and have the character be controlled by the gamepad as well as the inventory menu itself. So we're starting with just this same scene that we ended up with in the last video. So let's get started. So now I'm going to bring in a Game Creator 2 character. So let's create that. I'm not going to create it because if we go ahead and go into the inventory examples and we go to prefabs, there's a player inventory list of prefabs. So if we take a look at this, I'm going to drag it into the scene. I'm just going to create a section here for the player, and we'll put it in there. We'll call it player. And then we're going to just drag that in and underneath there, right there. So if you look at player inventory list, it's already set up with the right Y position and everything. It has already a bag on it that's configured with the inventory list skin. And it also has a remember if you're going to use the save system as well. But it already has an inventory, and not only that, it has an interactions inventory for the keyboard press of I to open the player bag up. So we're going to make a little bit of change to this though. So I'm going to unpack the prefab so I don't accidentally update the existing one there. And we're going to add a ground plane. So let's do that. Call it ground. And we'll make it 10 by 10. Okay. And, oh yeah. Make sure that the position is reset so it's at 0, 0, 0. And I'm also going to change the material to prototype guide darker. And with this one, I like to also change the tiling under surface inputs, but to 16 by 16. By default, it's 1 by 1 by 1. So it makes the squares a little bit smaller. And then we're going to add a camera shot. We'll call it a third person camera shot. I'm going to put that up next to the main camera. And we are going to have a section here for cameras. Okay. And the camera shot is the main shot. And we're going to set it to third person. And we're going to get rid of this. And I'm going to put this at 60. And the sensitivity should be 1. And also avoid clipping is turned on. So we need to set that in this main camera component to avoid clip to zoom in. And that should be fine. Okay. So let's just make sure, and I haven't done anything but let's take a look at how that works. I'm using my gamepad to control. So by default, it actually is working. The left stick, the player runs around, the right stick turns the camera, and then the X button is the jump button. So, and then the start button still bringing up that menu. So what I want to do is bind the select button to the inventory. So that's what we're going to do next. so that we can bring up the inventory. So we can bring it up with the I key right now, but we want to use the gamepad as well. So we want the select key. So what we're going to do is take a look at the player controls input actions editor, and we create a new one called inventory open. And I'll just recreate this. So let me just delete this. Okay. So in the player controls input actions editor, we're going to add another actions called inventory open close, I guess, because we're going to use it as a toggle as well. Inventory open close, and we need the binding. So this already has the two control schemes, keyboard and gamepad. So for the keyboard, we're going to use the keyboard, the I key, as we currently are. And then we're going to create another binding for the gamepad. And the path should be gamepad. And I'm going to use the select button and save asset. So that should be it in terms of that. If you say show derived bindings, it'll tell you which button on which controller it is, because it supports a whole bunch of different controllers. So to see if your controller is supported, you can look at that. So then we're just going to close this down. So we've got that set up. Okay, so the next step is to go into this interaction, and instead of keyboard press I, we're going to change this to input system input action perform. And then we take the player controls and select the inventory open close that we just created. And instead of open player bag and wait, we're going to use this as a toggle, because if we take a look at this with the gamepad and press the select button. Anyway, it's not working. How come? Oh, I know why. Okay. This needs to be set. Okay. So it'll bring it up with the select, and then you can navigate. It's working with the left, and you'll see the characters work moving as well. So we need to stop that. But the problem is there's no way to close this screen because you can't navigate up to that close button in the right hand corner. So what we're going to do is, instead of using the close button, which only works with the mouse, we're going to use the same button on the controller to toggle it, just like we did with the other menu. So instead of this, we're going to have a conditions. So let's set up a conditions, a run conditions, and we're going to add a conditions. And we're going to have two branches the same way. We're going to use that same variable. So we're going to have the compare bool of that variable, that same variable we were using before. The menu is paused. So if is paused is false, we're going to start with false. Then if it's not paused, we're going to pause it. And then we're going to replicate this branch, and we'll set the, if it's true. So if it's paused, we do one set of actions, and if it's true, we do another. And then we got to make sure we're running the conditions. So when we are going into the inventory, what we want to do is set the instruction to pause it. So set the bool. We'll turn it on, the paused. And then we want the open bag UI. And this time we're not going to wait to close. So it will open the player bag, and then, but it won't wait to close because we don't have anything in here that we need it to wait for. And then if it's paused as true, we're going to copy this and turn that off. So we're going to unpause it, and then we're going to close the bag UI instead. So now we're toggling it with the controls, so that should work now. Okay, so if I press select, it will turn it on and off, or I will toggle in and out of the menu, which a lot of games do that. They toggle it with the same control. So, and if I go into it, but you'll see the character still moving. So we need to fix that. So to do that, we could just do is controllable is false. And then we'll turn it back on over here. And then let's see, we're still going to see that the camera moves around. If I go in here, the camera still moves, but the player can't as we move this. So to fix that, there's two ways of doing that. We can either set the time scale to 0. So if we're pausing it, we can just set time scale to 0 and then set it back to 1 afterwards, and we'll see the effect of that. So go into the inventory, and now when I move the mouse or the gamepad around, it does not move the character. And then once we're out of there, it works. So there we go. Okay, so that's that. Oops, exit play mode, of course. So the next thing is, I want to give the player some. So we'll add a trigger here on start. We're going to give the player some items. So add item. So we'll see the difference if they have items. So we can just give him some default inventory items. So potions or whatever. I'm going to just give a few items to the player. Mana. Let's give him some of these. I'm going to give him a rune as well. Well, we'll see that there's an issue with that. Yeah, shield sword, and the helmet, I guess, is fine. So we've got a bunch of items. So now let's take a look at what it does when you have items already in there. So if there's items in there, it'll focus on the first item, and then we'll be able to move around with the the left stick. The left stick works better than the D-pad, I find. So then, and then when you click the X button or the A button, it'll open up the details panel, and then for some reason, it goes to the drop feature function the first time you go over there. And then when you go use, it uses it. You hear the sound effect, but now you've lost your cursor. So we need to fix this issue where now I can't navigate. I have to close it. And you'll see now he's doing the potion animation because we had it completely paused. So that's the reason. Now it's unpaused and the animation plays. So what we need to do is fix that other issue where, okay, and now let's see, player inventory. Let's see, trigger, turn that trigger off. So press select, and by default, if there's no items, there's nothing is focused on, so you can't navigate anything in here. So we can fix that. Why is there only 2 slots to? For some reason, there's only 2 of these two, but you'll notice that if we start with items, there'll be 3 slots. If there's items, no, there was only 2. For some reason, num3 is missing. Okay, so for the default, we can set a default field to be focused on because we know that the equipment slots are always going to be there. So if we go into the inventory UI prefab, that's the default inventory list prefab, and there are 3 slots. I'm not sure why those aren't showing up, but the equip slot. But if we go into just the top level here and add a trigger, I'm going to add an on enable trigger to say focus on equip slot 3. So we're going to say focus on equip slot 0 and then close the prefab and see that you've changed the default to equipment 0 actually. But that only happens if there's no, okay, let's see, if there's no items. Okay. So now we've got equipment slot 0. I'm not sure why the third thing isn't showing up, but in any case, so that's fixed. So if we want to turn this back on and see what happens when there's items, it still goes to equipment slot 0, so that's fine. So you can override that. The other thing we can do is if I use an item, it still gets rid of that thing by default. The mouse can bring it back, but if you don't have a mouse, right, you want to put it back afterwards. So you could do it a couple of ways, but you notice when if you look at what happens when you use an item, the button use here, it's not a Game Creator 2 button. It's a regular Unity button, so it actually runs the selected cell UI use function that's on the details node right here. It's calling a function inside of here to use the item. So really you can't, unless you want to change this to you could change it to a game creator button and then another um, have another instruction down below to focus on something after you use it. You could focus back here maybe. You could do that. But if you don't want to, like I don't want to change this too much, this prefab too much, right? So instead of doing that, what we could do is add a trigger input. So I'm just going to worry about it with the gamepad because um, gamepad press. So we can just set this to say the D-pad up, for instance. So if we go D-pad up, then we could just say focus on, and then we'll just set it to equip slot 0. So that way, because if you're using mouse and keyboard, you could just click on whatever you wanted to. But so now we should be able to get it back once we use an item. So use, and now if I go D-pad up, it goes back to the equipment. So then we get our cursor back. So that's one way of fixing it without making too many changes. The other problem is there's no way to navigate these tabs because these are tied to keyboard buttons. So we can actually make this so that we could bind a key on the gamepad for that as well. So let's take a look at that. We go into here. We go to the tabs section here. We have the tab all, for instance. So in each one of these tabs, there's a shortcut. This is how it's doing it. The shortcut here is set for the keyboard press digit 1. So when you press 1, it does a submit tab all. So let's say though we want to just cycle through it with the RB, the right bumper on the gamepad. So what we could do is set that up, and using a global variable we could do that. To get this working, we're going to use a global variable, and the global variable is just going to be current tab index, it's going to be called. So it's going to keep track of which tab we're currently on. So it's just a number, set it to 0 by default. Then in this tabs area right here, we can add a trigger, and it's going to be an input button, gamepad, press, and then we're going to use the right shoulder. And then when that happens, we are going to, first of all, we're going to need a local list variable. And it's going to have game objects in it. So we're going to have one per tab. So one for each of these tabs. Consumables, equipables, runes, and ingredients. So we're going to cycle through this. So when we click the button, we want iterator next is what we want. So we're going to take, it wants a global variable. So that's why we set it up as a global variable. So let's set the global variable, current tab index. And it also wants a local list. So this is this. So we're going to set it to tabs. And then the mode is circular, so that when it gets to the last one, it'll go back to the first one, so it'll just toggle through them circularly. And that all we need to do then is go submit. And the game object is going to be the local list variable, tabs, by index, and then that's where the global variable comes in. And then we're going to use current tab index. So we're going to, so each time we click the right shoulder, we're going to submit, increment and submit that, so it'll go to the next one. So let's see if that works. Go into the inventory, move that out, and then, so I press RB and it's working. So it's going to toggle through them in order. And if you wanted to do left, but the left one as well, you could do that as well. So let's see, prefabs. Go back to the tabs. You could do the same thing, but in the opposite direction. Actually, next, yeah, because then you would do previous, iterator previous. So if we want to do that, all we need is another trigger for the left shoulder. I'll move that up a little bit. So that one's going to be on input button. Not just gamepad. And then left shoulder. And then all we have to do is go do previous, iterator previous. And local list. Tabs, circular. And we do the same thing. Copy. Local list variable. Okay, yeah. That's right. Current tab index. Okay. And that should work. Okay, so that right and left. The right and the left shoulder is now filtering the items. So that's that. And the only other thing that there's a problem with is, and you can scroll this too with your left stick, but and then it's kind of trial and error to get the equip button to like, it'll be from there it goes, you go down and it's equipped, but it's basically relying on the Unity default UI setup to navigate through this. But the problem is you can't click on the socket. So if you wanted to socket an item, you can't do it with the gamepad. So because this relies on a drag and drop, so you can drag and drop it in, but you can't do it with the gamepad. So like, recommendation here is to um, redesign this with a gamepad in mind, so that instead of like having to drag and drop, you could maybe click it and then have a use button or something like that, or an assign button, and then it would ask you which one you want to assign it to. So, or you could go in here and have like a button to equip it instead of drag and drop. But that's a whole redesign of this interface, which is mainly designed for keyboard and mouse. But it could work um, if you didn't have sockets. You wouldn't have to worry about it. But you are expected to redesign this anyway because no, everyone's not going to ship their game with the same user interface. So you're expected to make it look like it's part of your game instead of just the examples here. So in any case, so we're almost done, but there's two problems we need to solve. Number one, let me just show you what happens when I load the inventory. So you'll see that there's only two out of the three num1, num2, the three slots at the bottom. Now, if I'm in the inventory screen and we've paused the game, the time scale is 0. If I press the start button, it will see that it continues. You know why? Because when we press the start button, it unpauses it because it's listening to the start button still, even though we're in the inventory menu. So when it unpauses it, you get time scale of 1, right? And then if I press it again, you can see it brings up the menu in the background. We should not be able to do that. We don't want to be able to bring up the menu. So if I'm in this menu, I shouldn't be able to bring up inventory, but it does that. So, and because it's pausing time, it doesn't load the whole menu um, correctly unless you unfreeze time. So there's two issues here we need to fix. So number one, I think instead of setting the time scale to 0 in the inventory, we are going to get rid of that, and we will get rid of it here. And instead, what we're going to do is set the sensitivity of the camera. So we set the camera shot, third person camera shot. We're going to set that to 0 when we open, when it's paused. And then we will set it back to 1 when we close the bag and re-enable the player. Then we'll set it back to normal. So now we're not touching the timescale, so it should load correctly. Because for some reason, if you set the timescale and it's still loading, the inventory will pause loading. So we don't want that. So it's open, and now it's loaded completely. But and then we can get in and out of it, no problem. But now we're still faced with that problem of having two menus open at the same time. So we're going to fix that next by when we are in the inventory menu, we want to disable the regular menu. So what we're going to do is we'll see here that there's a trigger that's listening to the menu open close button. So when we go into the inventory, which is here, we can disable that trigger by disabling the component. So you go menu, disable component, and then trigger. And there's only one trigger on there. So we're going to disable the trigger. There's only one trigger on this game object. So there's no problem there. And we are going to re-enable it when we close the inventory. So that would be enable component on the menu trigger, and then we close the bag. And then in this menu, what we want to do is disable the inventory one. So we want to disable this trigger, and there is only one trigger on this game object. So we disable this trigger so that when we're in this menu, we can't bring up inventory. So we want to disable that component here, this inventory, the inventory trigger. And then this one, we will enable that component. And that should do it. Now this should fix our issues. So let's test it out. So we go into inventory, and now we can't, no matter how many times I press the start button, nothing happens, and I can do whatever I need to do in inventory. The camera's not moving, and I can press the start button or the I key, and we're back to normal. And now when we go into this menu, I should not be able to get into the inventory. So when I'm pressing I or select, nothing's happening. So that's working as normal, and then we're back to normal. And we have it set to this time scale is being turned off. So with this menu, you can actually pause the game. And in the inventory, you're not actually pausing the game. In the inventory, you're not really pausing the game. You're just preventing the camera from moving around. So that's it for this video. Like and subscribe if you want more videos like this. And thanks for watching, and thanks to all my patrons as usual. I appreciate your support, and we will see you in the next one.